June 26, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. The checkers game lay unfinished as Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald lifted his gaze. A man stood at the screen door, introducing himself, but the name didn't immediately register. MacDonald's attention had been on his game with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, the operations officer for Satan's Angels. The civilian repeated his name with quiet assurance, making MacDonald pause. Charles Lindbergh, the Charles Lindbergh, America's most famous aviator, was standing in a makeshift recreation hall thousands of miles from home, requesting a moment to discuss P-38 combat operations. What neither man realized at that instant was that this encounter would transform long-range fighter tactics in the Pacific. Over the following 6 weeks, Lindbergh would teach techniques that extended the P-38 Lightning's combat radius by nearly 400 miles, turning what pilots had considered impossible into standard practice. This story is more than a technical achievement. It is a tale of overcoming institutional inertia, of pilots learning to trust careful calculation over instinct, and a one-man's mastery of fuel efficiency reshaping aerial warfare in the Pacific. The formulas for extended range weren't written in manuals. They were discovered in the key, day-to-day experience of pilots learning that much of what they had been taught about engine management was incomplete. The extraordinary was about to become routine, guided by a 42-year-old civilian who had only flown a P-38 3 days prior. The road that led Lindbergh to that screen door began 17 years earlier, over the Atlantic. On May 20th to 21st, 1927, Charles Augustus Lindbergh changed aviation forever, flying solo from New York to Paris in 33.5 hours. His Ryan NYP monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, carried 450 gallons of fuel in tanks so large they blocked his forward view. Navigating by periscope and dead reckoning, he managed fuel with a precision that would have seemed obsessive to other pilots. He touched down at Le Bourget Field with 85 gallons remaining, achieving fuel efficiency experts had thought impossible for a Wright Whirlwind radial engine. That meticulous focus on fuel economy became the foundation of Lindbergh's technical expertise. Throughout the 1930s, Lindbergh conducted survey flights for Pan American Airways across the Pacific and Atlantic, refining methods to extend aircraft range well beyond manufacturer specifications. He understood that published figures were averages, not limits. Every engine had an optimal operating envelope where power, fuel consumption, and stress reached balance. Finding it required mastering the relationships between manifold pressure, propeller RPM, mixture settings, and indicated airspeed, far beyond standard pilot training. By 1944, Lindbergh had become a global authority on long-range flight, but his relationship with the U.S. military was complicated. His pre-war isolationism and leadership in the America First Committee drew the ire of President Franklin Roosevelt. In 1941, after Roosevelt publicly compared him to a Confederate sympathizer, Lindbergh resigned his Air Reserve Commission. When Pearl Harbor forced America into war, Roosevelt personally blocked him from serving in uniform again. Expertise, however, always finds a way. Lindbergh became a civilian consultant for aircraft manufacturers, joining United Aircraft Corporation in 1943. He worked with their Transvaal division, makers of the F-4U Corsair, troubleshooting B-24 production issues at Ford's Willow Run, flying high-altitude P-47 tests, and helping develop Corsair dive bombing techniques. His contributions were vast, but he longed for combat. By early 1944, he saw his chance. United Aircraft wanted to study a new twin-engine fighter, the P-38 Lightning. Lindbergh convinced them to send him to the Pacific as a technical observer to watch P-38s in combat. On April 3, 1944, he prepared for deployment, buying a naval officer's uniform without insignia and a small New Testament. In his journal, he wrote, "Since I can only carry one book and a very small one, that is my choice. It would not have been a decade ago. But the more I learn and the more I read, the less competition it has. On April 24, 1944, Lindbergh departed San Diego, officially bound for Marine Corps aviation bases around Guadalcanal in the South Pacific. His journey was approved by the Navy Department but kept entirely secret from the White House. Neither President Roosevelt nor Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, were aware that Lindbergh was headed into an active combat zone. What began as a simple observation role quickly evolved when Marine Corps aviation officers invited Lindbergh to accompany combat sorties. On May 21, 1944, he flew his first mission with Marine Fighting Squadron 222 near the Japanese garrison at Rabaul. While officially observing, Lindbergh flew with his guns hot, engaging targets whenever opportunity allowed. He immediately demonstrated expertise that went beyond theoretical knowledge. Working closely with Corsair pilots, he taught them how to safely take off with bomb loads that exceeded the F-4U's rated capacity, a solution to a problem that had been causing frequent overweight accidents. Lindbergh's precise calculations of power settings, takeoff speeds, and weight distribution minimized losses while enhancing strike capabilities. News of the legendary aviator flying combat missions as a civilian and solving operational challenges spread quickly through the Pacific theater. By mid-June 1944, Lindbergh's focus had shifted to the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft's interest in twin-engine fighters was genuine, but Lindbergh also knew that the 475th Fighter Group, nicknamed Satan's Angels, was one of the most accomplished P-38 units in the Pacific. This was the place to study the aircraft in action. On June 15, 1944, Lindbergh arranged transport to Finchen, New Guinea, and reported to 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nadsab, where he lunched with Colonel Marion Cooper. A few days later, on June 18th, he dined with General Enos Whitehead to discuss developments in New Guinea and outline his plans to observe P-38 operations. The authorization was informal, unofficial, and lacked the usual paperwork. But in the fluid command structure of the Southwest Pacific, proven skill and personal connections mattered more than bureaucracy. On June 20th, Lindbergh spent 80 minutes getting checked out in a P-38 with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group. It was his first flight in the distinctive twin-boom fighter. 6 days later, on June 26th, he arrived at Hollandia and interrupted Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald's checkers game. MacDonald, 29 years old and a 10-victory ace, commanded the 475th Fighter Group, activated in Australia on May 14, 1943, and one of the highest-scoring P-38 units in the theater. The group's 3 squadrons, the 431st, 432nd, and 433rd, flew the latest P-38J models, featuring improved intercoolers and additional fuel capacity. These Lightnings had the longest range of any fighters in the Pacific, capable of missions no other aircraft could attempt. Yet, even with drop tanks, the P-38's operational radius was limited. Long missions often left pilots with dangerously low fuel reserves, and several aircraft had been lost when weather forced longer than planned detours. At first, MacDonald politely ignored Lindbergh, returning to his game. But when Lindbergh explained that General Hutchinson, 3rd Air Task Force commander, had sent him to discuss P-38 combat operations, MacDonald's attention sharpened. After a brief discussion, he invited Lindbergh to fly a mission the next day. Lindbergh agreed. Rather than returning to headquarters, he stayed at the 475th camp to simplify logistics. News spread quickly. Charles Lindbergh would be flying with Satan's Angels. Reactions among the pilots were mixed. Lieutenant John Perurti of the 403rd Squadron was excited to meet the famous aviator, while others were skeptical. Could a 42-year-old civilian handle modern combat? Major Thomas McGuire, a 15-victory ace who would finish the war with 38 confirmed kills, was curious to see what Lindbergh could do. On the morning of June 27, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for his first P-38 combat mission. Rain fell steadily at 05:30, but by 10:30, conditions improved enough for takeoff. MacDonald led 4 aircraft toward Jeffman Island and Smart Airfield, regular targets for the 475th. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3 on McGuire's wing, with the other aircraft piloted by Merrill Smith, an 8 Victory Ace. McDonald watched as Lindbergh slipped into perfect formation, a flawless display for someone who had checked out in the P-38 just days earlier. The mission targeted an enemy barge in Kibos Bay. Weaving through anti-aircraft fire, Lindbergh's cannons and machine guns cut into the target, proving immediately that his presence in combat was far more than ceremonial. The mission went smoothly, and all 4 aircraft returned safely. But the ground crews noticed something remarkable that would prove even more significant than the combat itself. After examining Lindbergh's P-38 following several sorties, they saw a consistent pattern. His aircraft returned with far more fuel than others flying identical missions. On July 1st, during a 6-12-hour armed reconnaissance along the western shore of Gilvink Bay, Lindbergh landed with 210 gallons remaining. Other pilots on the same mission were nearly empty. 2 days later, on July 3rd, the group escorted 16 B-25 bombers on a strike against Jeffman Island. Afterward, the Lightnings went on a barge hunting mission. Within the hour, 2 pilots were forced to break off due to low fuel. But Lindbergh continued, his gauges showing comfortable reserves. Colonel MacDonald took notice and called a meeting. 2 days after Lindbergh's arrival, he gathered the 475th pilots in the crude recreation hall. Palm thatch roof, packed dirt floors, a single ping-pong table, and a few card decks. Under the harsh light bulbs, MacDonald formally introduced Lindbergh and asked him to explain why his aircraft consistently returned with more fuel than anyone else's. What followed would fundamentally change P-38 operations across the Pacific. Lindbergh outlined his cruise control method for the Lightning. Standard P-38 procedure dictated cruising at 2,400 RPM with the mixture set to auto-rish. This was safe and reliable, but fuel inefficient. Lindbergh explained that by reducing engine speed to 1,600 RPM, adjusting the mixture to auto-lean, and slightly increasing manifold pressure to offset the lower RPM, pilots could dramatically reduce fuel consumption without losing effective cruise speed. He recommended 1,600 RPM, 30 inches of manifold pressure, mixture on auto-lean, and an indicated airspeed of 185 mph. This reduced fuel use to roughly 70 gallons, achieving about 2.6 miles per gallon. Compared to standard settings, the savings were enormous. Lindbergh projected that these adjustments could extend the Lightning's operational radius by 400 miles, allowing 9-hour missions. After the half-hour briefing, the room was silent. Pilots wrestled with the implications. They already found 7-hour missions punishing, cramped cockpits, emergency gear beneath them, and uncomfortable survival suits. 9 hours seemed almost impossible. Even more concerning, Lindbergh was advocating engine settings they had been explicitly trained to avoid. Operating at low RPM with high manifold pressure, oversquare, was warned against, as it could overheat cylinder heads and destroy engines. Skepticism filled the room. Some pilots shook their heads. One openly called it dangerous. But MacDonald saw what others didn't. Lindbergh wasn't theorizing. He had flown combat missions using these settings, and his P-38 had returned repeatedly without issues, often with significant fuel reserves. The colonel decided the only way forward was a test. If it worked, the 475th would gain a decisive advantage. If it failed, they would know quickly. Over the next week, pilots cautiously experimented with Lindbergh's settings, keeping flights short in case engines showed distress. The first pilots noticed a difference. The engines sounded unusual at lower RPM, but early reports were promising. The deep growl of the Allison V1710 engines changed subtly, but all gauges remained within safe limits. Oil pressure stayed steady, and cylinder head temperatures, the critical measure for detonation, were actually cooler than at higher RPMs. Confidence in Lindbergh's method grew quickly, and pilots began applying it on longer missions. The results were undeniable. Flights that previously required an immediate return after striking targets could now include extended combat patrols. Missions that demanded constant fuel management ended with comfortable reserves. The P-38's effective combat radius, formerly around 570 miles, stretched to 700 miles, then 750 miles. Pilots discovered they could reach distant targets, engage over the target for 15 minutes, and still return with a full hour of fuel in reserve. The transformation was remarkable. Skepticism vanished as mission after mission confirmed the technique's reliability. Lindbergh flew often with the 475th, teaching through example and accumulating combat hours alongside the pilots. His call sign on these missions was simple: Mr. Lindbergh. He explained the principles behind the method, helping pilots understand why it worked. Engines generate power by burning fuel to drive pistons. Fuel consumption depends on how much fuel is burned per unit of time. High RPM cruise settings created lots of power, but were inefficient, cycling fuel rapidly without maximizing energy output. By lowering RPM and slightly increasing manifold pressure, the engine produced equivalent power with fewer combustion cycles, each using fuel more efficiently. Running a lean mixture further reduced waste by providing just enough fuel for complete combustion, eliminating the surplus normally added for cooling in auto-rig mode. The engines didn't detonate because, despite the over-square ratio, the setting was not high-power operation. A manifold pressure of 30 inches was moderate, far below the 60-inch war emergency power used for takeoff or combat. Lower RPM even reduced mechanical stress on components. The technique wasn't dangerous. It was just different from standard training. Lindbergh's expertise came from decades of long-range flying. His 1927 Atlantic crossing had taught him that published aircraft limits were starting points, not ceilings. His Pan American Airways survey work across the Pacific and Atlantic in the 1930s gave him thousands of hours experimenting with fuel efficiency. The P-38's twin engines made experimentation less risky than it might seem. If one engine suffered damage from the new cruise method, the other could bring the aircraft home. In contrast, single-engine fighters over the vast Pacific required extreme conservatism. Mechanical failure often meant drowning or capture. P-38 pilots had a margin of safety, and Lindbergh calculated the risk as acceptable, especially since Allison shipped plenty of spare V-1710 engines and parts to the theater. A damaged engine could be replaced quickly. By late July 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control techniques had spread across 5th Air Force P-38 units. The 475th's dramatic success was impossible to ignore. Word traveled to other squadrons, pilots shared tips, ground crews compared fuel data, and other commanders wanted the same operational edge. Lindbergh conducted additional briefings for pilots from other units, ensuring the knowledge spread rapidly. He explained the technique carefully, fielding technical questions and addressing concerns about engine safety. Adoption was gradual, not universal, but it steadily spread. July 28, 1944, marked Lindbergh's most dramatic mission with the 475th. He was assigned to a bomber escort over the Seram area, flying with the 403rd Squadron as Blue 3 in a 4-plane formation above El Puti Bay. The flight soon encountered enemy aircraft. 2 Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya light bombers returning from reconnaissance for a missing comrade. These aircraft belonged to the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai, one piloted by the unit's commanding officer, Captain Saburo Shimada, the other by Sergeant Yokogi. Though outmatched, slower, less maneuverable, and lightly armed compared to the P-38s, the Sonyas did not surrender easily. Shimada, an experienced pilot, turned the engagement into a tense running battle. P-38s from the 9th Fighter Squadron had already engaged the Sonyas when McDonald's flight arrived. Sergeant Yokogi's aircraft caught cannon fire from Lieutenant Wade Lewis, igniting the left wing. As the enemy plane tried to escape, Lieutenant J.C. Haslip fired a long burst, sending the damaged Sonya trailing smoke into the sea. Shimada's Sonya continued to fight, outmaneuvering multiple P-38s for a grueling 30 minutes. The Japanese captain executed violent banks and extreme turns, wingtips streaming condensation, consistently staying just out of the American pilot's gun sights. Captain Danforth Miller, McDonald's wingman, briefly tracked Shimada but lost him in a hard left turn, tracers falling 80 feet behind. Then Shimada did something unexpected. Instead of continuing evasive maneuvers, he turned directly toward Lindbergh. The two planes closed at nearly 500 mm. For Lindbergh, a pilot with thousands of hours but never under direct threat, the danger became immediate and terrifying. Shimada maintained his course, whether hoping to ram or engage head-on. Lindbergh instinctively targeted the Sonya's radial engine and pressed the trigger. The P-38's nose-mounted 20mm cannon and 50 caliber machine guns unleashed a 6-second burst. Shells hammered the Sonya's engine, visibly slowing the propeller as smoke poured from the cowling. At the last moment, Lindbergh pulled up sharply, passing just over the damaged aircraft. The Sonya dove steeply, trailing smoke as additional P-38 bursts raked it. Moments later, it struck the ocean at high speed, a fountain of white spray marking the impact. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were killed. Back at base, the kill credit was discussed. Multiple pilots had fired on the Sonya, but it was Lindbergh's head-on burst that inflicted the fatal damage. Unofficially, the pilots agreed Lindbergh had scored his first and only kill. It was never recorded in the 475th's official records. As a civilian flying irregularly, an official credit could have jeopardized his continued participation with the unit. Just 3 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh narrowly survived another mission, a fighter sweep to the Palau Islands. During one mission, Lindbergh's flight encountered Japanese Zeros. In the ensuing dogfight, he became engaged in a turning battle with a Zero pilot and came dangerously close to being shot down. Only McDonald's timely command, break right, and his direct engagement with the enemy saved Lindbergh's life. This close call convinced 5th Air Force headquarters that it was time to act. Lindbergh had already proven the effectiveness of his techniques. Over his Pacific service, he had flown roughly 50 combat missions, including about 25 P-38 sorties, with the 475th, scored a confirmed kill, and nearly lost his life. It was now time to send him back to the United States before something irreparable occurred. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh departed Hollandia. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group gathered to see him off, their respect for the civilian consultant evident. He had not only taught them methods to extend their combat radius, but had flown alongside them, fought with them, and demonstrated that fame and rank meant nothing in battle. The effects of Lindbergh's fuel-saving techniques quickly spread beyond the 475th. By October 1944, P-38 units throughout the Pacific were adopting variations of his cruise control settings. While exact numbers differed slightly depending on unit and conditions, the underlying principle was universal: lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, and a leaner fuel mixture dramatically extended range. The operational consequences were significant. Previously unreachable targets were now within range. Japanese bases that had once been safe from fighter escort faced P-38s with sufficient fuel to fight over targets and return home. Extended range enabled fighters to escort bombers on missions that had previously been unescorted or had not been attempted. Long-range sweeps could now penetrate deeper into Japanese-held territory. In Dutch New Guinea, P-38s were flying 950-mile missions, engaging targets for 15 minutes and returning safely, flights that had been impossible before Lindbergh's methods became standard. The increased range directly supported MacArthur's push toward the Philippines. Forward airfields that had been out of range could now be used, and invasion plans that required waiting for closer bases could proceed more quickly. The impact was measured not just in miles, but in time. Operations that would have taken months were completed in weeks. The technique also enhanced pilot safety. Aircraft that had once returned with nearly empty tanks now had fuel reserves for emergencies. Bad weather or combat damage no longer meant certain loss. These reserves provided a buffer that reduced non-combat losses and increased the chance of returning home safely. During the October 1944 invasion of Leyte, P-38s flying from New Guinea and Morotai could cover targets at distances previously impossible. Having an hour of fuel reserve rather than none could mean the difference between providing effective fighter cover and merely arriving over the target. Adoption of the method was not without initial resistance. Some commanders worried about engine reliability, some pilots doubted a civilian's advice, and some maintenance officers feared increased engine wear. Yet the results were undeniable. Units employing Lindbergh's techniques reported no uptick in engine failures. Fuel consumption data showed dramatic improvement, and mission reports documented successful operations that had been previously unfeasible. By late 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control technique had become standard doctrine. What had started as the work of a civilian consultant observing operations was officially integrated into P-38 procedures. Updated cruise control charts reflected Lindbergh's discoveries, and pilot training materials were revised to include lean of peak, mixture operation as part of standard instruction. The broader narrative of Lindbergh's Pacific service highlights a man driven by complex motivations. Before the war, his isolationist stance had made him a contentious figure. His public remarks on aviation developments in Nazi Germany led to accusations of Nazi sympathy, and his opposition to U.S. entry into World War II had severed his relationship with President Roosevelt. When the conflict began, Lindbergh found himself a pariah, despite being one of America's most celebrated aviators. In the Pacific theater, far from the politics of Washington, he found redemption through his technical skill. The Marine and Army Air Force pilots who flew alongside him judged him by his flying ability and courage, rather than political opinions. Major Richard Bong, America's top-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories, remarked to a United Press reporter that Lindbergh was as skilled a pilot as any of us. He would have been out there scoring victories daily if General Kenny had permitted. Praise from someone of Bong's stature carried far more weight than any political rehabilitation could. In combat, Lindbergh had proven himself where proof mattered most. After returning to the United States in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh continued contributing technically to the war effort. In October, he participated in a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter aircraft performance at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland. He flew and evaluated captured Japanese planes, offering insights into enemy capabilities, while continuing his consulting work with United Aircraft and other manufacturers to troubleshoot operational challenges encountered in combat. The technical impact of Lindbergh's work was substantial. The P-38J Lightning had an internal fuel capacity of 410 gallons in standard tanks, supplemented by two 90-gallon main tanks, two 60-gallon reserve tanks, and two 55-gallon leading-edge tanks, with provisions for external drop tanks. Total fuel could exceed 1,000 gallons at standard cruise settings of 2,200 RPM with an Autoric mixture, but consumption was much higher than with Lindbergh's method. Using his cruise control technique, fuel usage dropped to roughly 70 gallons per hour, increasing combat radius from about 570 miles to 750 miles while maintaining the same reserves. For maximum range missions, combining his method with drop tanks allowed flights of nearly 9 hours, covering over 1,000 miles, capabilities that transformed operations across the Pacific. The MacArthur's strategic island-hopping campaign through New Guinea and the Philippines relied heavily on air superiority. Fighter range dictated which islands could be bypassed and which required direct assaults to secure airfields. By extending operational reach, Lindbergh's techniques enabled more ambitious planning. Islands previously necessitating costly amphibious assaults could now be bypassed because fighters could reach targets from farther afield. Some historians have mistakenly credited Lindbergh with range extensions during the April 1943 mission that intercepted Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport. While that operation did push the Lightning's limits, Lindbergh had not yet arrived in the Pacific. His true contribution was making these extreme-range missions routine rather than exceptional. The human element of Lindbergh's achievement is equally noteworthy. At 42, he flew combat missions alongside pilots nearly half his age. He endured the physical and mental demands of high-stress maneuvering, cramped cockpits, and flights lasting 7 to 9 hours without complaint. Lindbergh never sought special treatment. He undertook the same missions, faced the same dangers, and adhered to the same procedures as the young lieutenants and captains of the 475th. His willingness to personally demonstrate his techniques was critical to their acceptance. Had he lectured from the safety of headquarters, pilots would likely have dismissed him as a theorist detached from real combat. By flying these missions and proving the effectiveness of his methods firsthand, Lindbergh earned a level of credibility that rank or fame alone could never provide. The psychological influence of Lindbergh's success went far beyond fuel management alone. He showed that civilian technical expertise could have a real impact on combat operations. Military structures naturally prioritize rank and combat experience, but modern warfare increasingly demanded specialized technical knowledge that often existed outside traditional chains of command. Lindbergh demonstrated that civilians with the right skills could significantly enhance operational effectiveness, if given the chance. His accomplishments encouraged commanders to engage more openly with civilian technical representatives from aircraft manufacturers, engine producers, and research organizations. This improved collaboration between the military and civilian experts, accelerated the pace of technological innovation during the war. The P-38 Lightning itself played a crucial role in enabling Lindbergh's techniques. Its twin-engine layout provided redundancy that made experimentation safer. The Allison V1710 engines, despite being criticized for some shortcomings, responded well to careful mixture and power management. The Lightning's fuel system, with multiple tanks and transfer pumps, allowed pilots to control fuel precisely. Its stability made extended cruise flights feasible, and its design accommodated long-duration missions effectively. By late 1944 and early 1945, the P-51 Mustang was gradually replacing the P-38 in certain theaters due to superior high-altitude performance and longer range per fuel load. Yet in the Pacific, the P-38 remained indispensable. Its twin engines offered safety over water, its heavy armament delivered potent firepower, and its low to medium altitude maneuverability matched the demands of Pacific combat. With Lindbergh's fuel management techniques, its range remained exceptional. The results speak for themselves. The 475th Fighter Group, flying exclusively P-38s, tallied 551 aerial victories, making it the top P-38 unit of the war. Major Thomas Maguire, America's second highest scoring ace with 38 confirmed kills, flew P-38s with this group. The combination of range, firepower, and reliability made the P-38 dominant, and Lindbergh's techniques amplified every aspect of its operational capability. Missions could reach farther, engage longer, and return more safely. The cumulative effect over thousands of sorties and hundreds of thousands of flight hours was profound. The story also highlights the sometimes uneasy relationship between expertise and institutions. Lindbergh's pre-war political views had made him unwelcome in official military service, and Roosevelt's personal opposition prevented him from wearing a uniform. Yet the Army Air Forces required exactly the skills Lindbergh possessed. The solution? A civilian with informal authorization to participate in combat was unconventional and would likely violate today's regulations. Nevertheless, it worked. Institutional rigidity yielded to operational pragmatism, delivering tangible benefits to the war effort. The men who flew with the Lindbergh never forgot his lessons. Decades later, former pilots of the 475th spoke with admiration of the civilian who had flown alongside them as an equal and taught them to reach farther than they thought possible. Colonel Warren Lewis, commander of the 432nd Squadron, recalled Lindbergh's fuel-saving techniques in precise detail years afterward. While specifics varied slightly depending on conditions or aircraft, the underlying principles were universal, and the results undeniable. Charles Augustus Lindbergh passed away on August 26, 1974, at the age of 72, succumbing to lymphoma at his home in Kipahulu, Maui. He had quietly left the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York on August 17th, arriving in Maui just 1 week before his death. He was laid to rest roughly 3 hours after his death in a modest handmade coffin crafted by Hawaiian ranch cowboys dressed in work clothes. The grave, 30 feet deep, was lined with lava rock and black beach pebbles at Palapalahu Church Cemetery. Only 15 people attended. The marker was a simple concrete slab inscribed with a verse from Psalm 139. "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." Lindbergh's wartime journals, published in 1970, provided a detailed record of his Pacific service, including his time with the 475th Fighter Group. His legacy extends far beyond the specific fuel-saving techniques he introduced. He illustrated enduring principles. Technical expertise can be decisive in combat. Civilian specialists can make significant contributions when given the chance. Institutional procedures should evolve when evidence supports change. Personal demonstration carries more weight than abstract argument, and even established systems can be improved. Ultimately, Lindbergh's work in the Pacific represented a unique intersection of specialized knowledge and operational necessity. The theater demanded extreme fighter range, yet conventional procedures limited what the aircraft could achieve. Lindbergh brought decades of expertise in fuel efficiency and the courage to apply it in the harshest conditions, measuring results directly in combat. He worked alongside pilots as a peer, not relying on fame, proving his theories through action rather than assertion. Just as German prisoners of war had been influenced by the visible might of American industry, Lindbergh's example demonstrated that knowledge applied precisely and proven in practice could transform outcomes. The pilots who learned from him gained operational advantages that literally saved lives. The P-38 Lightning continued to serve throughout the war, its twin-boom silhouette a symbol of American air power. Pilots remembered the aircraft fondly, quirks and all, and also remembered the civilian who taught them that the impossible was only difficult, that published limits were starting points, and that mastery of an aircraft could unlock hidden potential. Lindbergh's Pacific legacy lies not in the missions flown or combat victories, but in the knowledge he shared and the techniques he imparted. He arrived as an observer and left as a teacher. He came as a celebrity and departed as a comrade. Through understanding how the P-38 truly worked and daring to prove better methods existed, he transformed the aircraft's capabilities. The pilots of Satan's angels recognized what he had given them. They flew farther, fought longer, and returned safer thanks to a civilian's mastery of fuel efficiency. The lessons he taught, verified in combat and adopted across the Pacific, became one of the most impactful technical innovations of the Pacific Air War. And it came not from laboratories or design bureaus, but from one man's deep understanding of an art he had first mastered 17 years earlier over the Atlantic. Applied in a new context with different aircraft, his principles remained just as effective in 1944 as they had been in 1927. Know the aircraft completely, manage resources precisely, and never accept published limits as real limits. Lindbergh lived that principle, and for 6 weeks in the summer of 1944, he taught it to some of the finest fighter pilots in the Pacific, pilots who then spread that knowledge further, reshaping how America fought the air war.